Welcome to Law Talk Today, a series devoted to bringing you informative and educational programs focused on issues of law, government, and community. Hello and welcome to Law Talk Today. I'm Dan Agatino, your host. Joining us in studio today are attorneys Chris Colabella and Susan Carlson of the law firm of Gruber, Colabella, Liuzza, and Williams. Chris, thanks so much for joining us a second
Dan,
time.
thanks for having me back.
Susan, thanks for coming on again.
Thanks, Dan. It's good to be back.
When we last left, we were talking about bankruptcies.
Yes, we were.
And that was a last option, but it is a real and viable option. I know that some people feel after the bankruptcy laws changed a few years ago that it's almost impossible to declare. But that's not the case, is it?
No, it's not. Matter of fact, I think bankruptcies are on the rise more and more. People are just trying to get out from the debt and start fresh with a clean slate.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what the requirements are?
Well, just, we left off last time talking about all of the different options that you have in dealing with consumer credit, dealing with mortgage issues. When those options are exhausted, bankruptcy as a last resort is really a great way to get a fresh start. An individual filing bankruptcy could file under Chapter 7 of the Bankruptcy Code or Chapter 13 of the Bankruptcy Code. And you're right, the law did change in 2005, and the new law, it's the Bankruptcy Abuse Prevention and Consumer Protection Act of 2005. I think I got that right.
I think you did.
That's right. And essentially the law really had not been modified for many years. I think the law was modified prior to that several times in between, slight modifications, but an overhaul took place, I think, in 1978. So it was a long time.
Almost 30 years passed.
Almost 30 years. And the new law, it's definitely stricter, there's no question, but it doesn't eliminate the possibility for individuals to file for bankruptcies. It just scrutinizes who really qualifies a lot closer than the old law. The old law, if somebody came into the office and they had a bunch of consumer credit cards or they had a mortgage that was in foreclosure, you could do a Chapter 7. You could pretty much liquidate everything. The income issues weren't that much of an issue. And now when a bankruptcy trustee is the person who's appointed to oversee a bankruptcy, say a Chapter 7 is filed, which we call it's a liquidation. A Chapter 13 is generally referred to as a reorganization. The trustee takes a look at the petition, and the individual has to pass what's called a means test. And that's new. And it's based on what the mean income is in the community that you live in, and whether or not that individual is above that mean, or whether or not he has sufficient expenses and dependents, because that number actually increases with the number of dependents that you're supporting, and also it gets modified based on the amount of expenses. And there's a formula that's applied that I'm not going to get into because it's to do that on the show would be a little complicated, that will determine whether or not an abuse is present. And that's the goal of the means test. If the person doesn't pass the means test and the trustee determines that there's an abuse, you may have to file a Chapter 13, which means that you would have to pay the creditors back, 10 cents, 20 cents, 30 cents on a dollar. And that's how that would. So those are the two basic options.
What I wanted to do, if we could, is to come up with maybe some hypotheticals so that people who are watching say, that's my situation.
Okay.
So can you give us a situation where maybe, without giving us specific names of a client, that you could say is a common and usual bankruptcy client?
I would tend to say so far the clients that I see could probably be lumped into two categories, the most common of which is where somebody has taken an income reduction and now they're using credit cards over the past couple years to maintain the same standard of living that they got used to when their salaries were higher, whether it be because one of the spouses quit to have, one of the biggest scenarios is where the wife quit working because the baby came.
Yeah, you see that often.
And now there's, instead of one child, there's two children. And they got used to a certain lifestyle, but now the income of the wife is not there or she's working less. So there is a little bit of income, but it's significantly less than what she had. So what they're doing is they're putting it on the credit card so they can do the trip here, the dinner there, buy diapers, buy food, because formula, diapers, things like that for children are expensive.
What about the balance transfers?
And of course, the balance transfers of your credit cards, because now you have a credit card company with 24% interest as opposed to 12% interest. So they transfer balances back and forth, and they're floating their payments among different companies. And now they've realized, oh my goodness, what was $3,000 or $4,000 is now turned into $20,000 or $30,000.
Right.
Or maybe they're not even communicating. The husband's using one card and the wife is using another, and they don't even realize each other have it because they have their own or separate checking accounts. And that's what you're seeing coming in quite often is, you know, the reduction of the income, and they're still trying to live the way they were before that income was reduced or negated in some way. And now they're gotten out of hand, for lack of a better term.
Okay, so that's one category. And what would be the second?
I think the second category pretty much just started stemming from divorce, that when the couple split up and they're asked to take their share of the debt, well, when you were pooling your income together to make the payments, you could afford to make some of those payments. Now that you've separated, you've got separate living expenses, so you've got 2 mortgages, you've got 2 rental payments, but when you separated the debt, you don't have the joint income to pay the debt off. You actually have your income plus the double living expenses because now you've separated. And so one or maybe both of the spouses end up filing for bankruptcy.
So it may be that when you're married and you share the living expenses, that the cost per person is much less than when you have to go and pay for your own living expenses, and that has a ripple effect.
Correct.
Definitely does. Yeah. I just to add, you know, I guess there was this, and it still is to some degree, this culture of having to, you know, have what, you know, keeping up with the Joneses,
right.
having what your neighbors had, and establishing a standard of living that may have been comfortable at one time, and once you suffer a decrease in income, and I've seen this time and time again, I imagine, Susan, you've seen this, individuals will use the credit cards, they'll do whatever it takes to maintain that, you know, standard of living. And I've seen this where they've actually taken balance transfers, you know, from other cards, and they've paid off certain debt over here. You know, you get a great deal from a certain bank, and they say no interest for 6 months.
Right.
They take $10,000, and what they do is they transfer all these credit cards over here, put it onto this balance transfer card, no interest. Do you think they cut up those other cards? No, of course not. Well, they got to keep up with the Joneses,
sure.
so they use those credit cards, and so now they have $10,000 over here, and then they have these credit cards with no balances. Like, this is great. So they go out and they're eating dinners and vacations, and then all of a sudden they got $10,000 here and they got $10,000 here. But lo and behold, another bank sends them a balance transfer opportunity, and guess what? They take this debt and they plop it on there, and then before you know it, they got 3 or 4 or 5 of these balance transfers.
Right.
And I had a guy come in the office the other day. 5 times he did that. He had $75,000 in credit card debt, and he had some good income for a while. And he's a middle manager, and he was out of work. He got laid off. He was out of work for a while, and when he went back to work, he was making about 3/4 of what he had been making at his last job. And of course, he couldn't service that debt. I mean, servicing $75,000 of credit card debt, incidentally, when you don't make the payments, the interest rate usually shoots up. They hit you for $39 a month in a late fee. It's impossible.
And it just starts to
Oh,
accrue.
it's impossible. So these folks are, forget it. You can't deal with it. And then compound that with their mortgage going into default. You know, they have to make a mortgage payment. Or if they have one of these subprime loans that we're hearing about, and their adjustable rate mortgage all of a sudden adjusted, and their payment shot up $500, $700, $1,000 a month, and they have all this credit card debt, they're in an impossible situation. Generally, I recommend that if they qualify, they try to do a Chapter 7, which is a liquidation. And generally, if you have a house in a Chapter 7 situation that's in default, you're usually not going to be able to save it unless you bring the mortgage current. And then the banks will generally reaffirm the debt. A reaffirmation is, it's an agreement that you enter into the bank. Despite the bankruptcy, you still want to make payments to them. Generally, you have to be current. And to compound that even further, they generally have car payments.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how many times have you seen that?
Oh.
You know, you're right, you get the mortgage, second mortgage, like a home equity line of credit. you got a car lease and a car payment, maybe even a boat payment. Throw a boat payment in there, and then you have $75,000 in credit card debt, and they've borrowed